Andriy, it's absolutely great to meet you. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me.
It's absolutely great to talk to you. Thank you for taking some time to talk to me.
So how do people decide what is newsworthy? Like, can you explain to us the process of people deciding what news is news, and who has the right to say that?
2 countries, 7 or 8 media outlets. The situation was different in every one of them. Of course, even at the bulwark of democracy and traditional free thinking, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, at the BBC you still had, when I started to work there, the so-called central pot of stories, whereby people who worked for the language services in the world service of the BBC were first of all obliged to look into the central pot, take several stories from there, insert them in their news bulletin, newscast, and then add some regional or local stories. And this is also about centralized dissemination of news. So in this case, it was some pundits and very experienced British, mostly British journalists, who decided what was important for Ukrainians or Finns or Russians or people in Vietnam to listen to, because there was a central pot. Then I tell you, I was in my 2nd year of service, and 3 or 4 minutes before I was to go on air with the newscast, there was a flash of stories from Kazakhstan. It came from Kazakh agencies and one international agency, I think it was Reuters. Having had virtually no time, I just printed out 3 or 4 of them, took this bunch of papers to the news studio, and composed the story as the newscast went. I don't think it was a perfect story, but it was okay from the point of view that it had different sources, it had unbiased presenter, it had, and all this kind of stuff. However, I was severely reprimanded after doing this, because I was told, you should have rung the central news desk and tell them, there are stories coming out of Kazakhstan. Could you please write a story for me, for my newscast, 3 minutes or 4 minutes before you go on air? So, okay, they would write a perfect story, of this I'm absolutely sure, but they would write this in English. Then I would wait for the story, get it in English, translate it into Ukrainian, and probably it will make to the next newscast. That's the choice that you face. That's about who makes decisions. And very often in Ukraine, especially in Ukraine from my experience, a journalist has to make her or his own choice and go against the flow and understand that the interests of the public at any given time are more important than your personal interests.
So you talked about the central desk at the BBC. So I want to ask you about what influence do owners of media versus editors versus the journalists themselves have on creating what the news story is about and how you spin it?
I think you forget one very important person here, the manager.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, because there's the owner, they have their own views. There's, okay, let's talk about the editor, who is basically interested or should be interested in the growth of authority and prestige and readership or viewership or listenership or usership of their media outlet. There are journalists who are interested, as we all are, in disseminating information, but also in making our own cases and in excelling, basically. But there's a manager who is responsible before the owner for the commercial success of the media outlet, which does not always run parallel to the authority and prestige. So in some cases, and I've known this, and I actually worked at one of such television channels. It is the manager who has the right, although I'll put it into inverted commas, the right to tell what kind of stories are more important today than the others. And then the editor's task in this imperfect system to accept this and try to tell about this in the most interesting way. I mean, organize the work of the journalists. To my mind, the editor is or has always to be the pivotal figure of any media outlet, and it is them who should define editorial policy.
Can you tell me about an experience when you as a journalist received some pushback from either the owners or other people involved in the process in creating a story?
A story. A person who actually taught me television, although he was 10 years younger than me, I was very good in print and radio, but I knew actually nothing about television. And Alexander Tkachenko, who now heads the 1+1 group, and who's become a different person since then, he actually taught me what television is. When he had to leave 1+1 television channel for political reasons, because he was at that time a very brave and critically minded journalist, I was appointed after some adventures to head the news service instead of him. And I was taken by the owners. By the way, here we have another personage who comes, the behind the scene mover. Sure. I was taken to the behind the scene mover, Mr. Rabinovich, who at that time, although he had no shares in 1+1, he had no official position at 1+1, but he told the owners what to do. And they introduced me to him, and he says, well, I don't care what his surname is, I don't care what language he speaks, I don't care whether he's a man or a woman, just do not show Yulia Tymoshenko on television. Then he thought for a while and said, and the less you say, show Alexander Moroz, the better, although I cannot forbid to show Alexander Moroz, who at the same time was chair of the Ukrainian parliament. But still, okay, I was so shocked that I didn't say nothing. And he understood this as my consent. I understood this as my, at least, that I abstained from giving my consent to him. When I came back, within 2 hours that they took me there and then back, it happened so that on this day, Yulia Tymoshenko, who then was a prominent opposition politician, who is still a prominent opposition politician, and this was in 22 years ago, or 21 years ago, she did something that deserved to be in the news. And when I came back, the piece of news was already ready. And I said, okay, of course, it should go, if not on top of the bulletin, then second slot in the newscast. So it went on air, and the next morning I was dismissed from the position of director of the news service.
Wow. But what should or maybe can a journalist do when they are receiving those kind of pressures?
My first advice is to upgrade their skills. The more qualified, the more skillful a journalist is, the harder it is for a manager or the editor or sometimes the owner to dismiss them or to make them do what they do not want to do. Because, well, it's obvious, if you are a good reporter or a popular radio or television presenter or a blogger for this matter, it is much more, if you are being fired or put to another job, this leads to losses on the part of the owner and the manager. So they tend to treat such people who have high qualification and high skills differently than the others. So you should always share your secrets or your skills with other people. You still will be in a winning position because it was you who found this or invented this and all this kind of stuff. So you have a bit more experience in doing this than the others. But the others should be right behind you in this. And then they will support you in a different, or there's a higher probability, the possibility that they will support you. Competition, yes, but not the fight for better topics or whatever. A union would be very, very good. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, and your contact with the audience. It is the audience who in many cases may protect you in many, many respects, may even protect you against being fired. When they say, listen, we want this person to be back, we like their articles, we like their radio shows, we like their photos, we like their videos. So, skills, colleagues, union, audience. Maybe in the Ukrainian case, audience and then union, because unions are very weak.